Hello dear friend faces, and welcome to How to Poe, the beginning. This is the first video of the 4-part series to kick off my channel where we will deep dive into all things poetry. And what better way to start a poetry channel than with a poem? Jaunty ankle choired, mood lighting engaged. Free love. Free love has been used to describe a social movement that rejects marriage, which is seen as a form of social bondage. The free love movement's initial goal was to separate the state from sexual matters, such as marriage, birth control, and adultery. Now, it probably didn't take you long to realize, despite my theatrics and the funky little line breaks in the text, that what I read wasn't a poem. I pulled it from Wikipedia's article on love, which is a common subject in poetry, but we could still tell that what I read was prose. How? Well, that's what today's video is about. So, let's get to it, Pruitt. Hello friend faces, I'm Abby Dorable, and I'm here to clear the air when it comes to poems, poets, and poetry, because as much as I love poetry, it really needs a bit of a renovation. If you love poetry too, if you're vaguely interested in what I'm talking about, or if you just like my hair and snazzy makeup, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button because it keeps the wee beasties away and it keeps the YouTube engines happy. Today we're going to start at the very beginning of what poetry actually is. Now, I know that you're probably thinking, I already know what poetry is. It's that stuff that old people wrote back in the day and it rhymes, like Shakespeare and stuff. Well, that's one very narrow way of looking at it, and while it's not entirely wrong, it's not entirely right either. Unless Shakespeare was writing a sonnet, he didn't really rhyme that much. Well, and rhyming. And poetry, while it does have a rich history, which Shakespeare is a part of, it's actually all around us every day. It's on Instagram, sort of, and TikTok. It's in our music, it's in our media, and it's actually part of language itself. Where there is language, there is poetry. After all, we could do like I did in the beginning. We could take prose and chop it into stanzas and do those funky little line breaks, then read it, and we'd still be able to tell that that's not poetry. At first glance, it may seem easy to describe poetry because we know it when we read it. And all of us have been exposed to poetry since our infancy with nursery rhymes, children's books, and it's a part of our music, it's a part of our culture. Whenever there are big events, people turn to poetry. We've learned about poetry in school with reading, English, and literature classes. And even outside of class assignments, we've probably all guiltily scratched away a poem or two that we have folded and stuck under our bed or in a sock drawer, hidden from everyone, never to see the light of day. Ever? Yeah. But poetry is so entrenched in our experience with language that, of course, we know what it is. So, who can give me a working definition, like word for word? I thought so. We all have this idea of what poetry is, but it's intangible and based on subjective and often instinctual knowledge that is so ingrained in us that we just know. However, when learning about anything, in order to all be on the same page and make sure we're all discussing the same thing, that thing has to be identified. So we need to get from an intangible idea to a worded definition that can be communicated concisely so that we know that we're talking about the same thing when we dive into what makes poetry work, how to understand it, and how to craft it. Not gonna lie, that's a bit daunting, but I am happy to try for you, dear friend faces, because, well, that's why I'm here. I'm going to cheat and go to the dictionary for a starting point. Well, is it really cheating since we're trying to build a definition? I don't think so. We may as well look at what others have done before us and see how it sits with what we have experienced, what others have documented experiencing, and what is collectively agreed upon. That way we can get closer to a truer answer with less energy expenditure. I'm all here for that. So, Merriam-Webster.com says that poetry is 1A, metrical writing. Verse. B, the productions of a poet. Poems. Okay, so just off the bat here, not all poetry is metered or in verse, and poetry can be a collective noun for poems, but that's not really what we're talking about, is it? I mean, yes, poetry is a group of poems, but that doesn't necessarily explain how we know poetry when we experience it. The second definition looks more promising, though. 2. Writing that formulates a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience and language, chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. Well, that's a mouthful. And it looks like there's a third definition here, but it might be a little bit unrelated. 3. A. Something likened to poetry, especially in beauty of expression. And B. Poetic quality or aspect. Example, poetry of dance. While those certainly are valid, they don't quite hit the mark, but they are interesting to think about poetry separate from poems. But let's take a look at this second definition in full. First, the whole thing discounts several important points, like poetry doesn't necessarily need to be written at all. It did begin as a performative or oral tradition. There's poetry out there that doesn't seek to generate an emotional response, like traditional haiku, for example. And sometimes meaning, sound, and rhythm aren't the tools that are used in creating a poem. But the concentrated imaginative awareness, that's kind of like what I experienced when I was little and I wrote my Halloween poem. And while it's not a particularly good poem, it certainly is a poem. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, make sure you visit my introduction video, but after we're done here. Now, it might be best if we turn our attention to those who might know poetry the best, the poets. I'm going to start with everyone's favorite quote about what poetry is. Like, literally, every single book on poetry I have read, the essays I have read, the lectures I have attended, the classes I've taken, almost everyone mentions this. It's almost obligatory at this point, so here I am with mine. But really, it's such a good quote. Let me introduce you to Emily Dickinson, a 19th century American poet and noted recluse who also liked to wear white. She said, very famously, "If I read a book and it makes my body so cold no fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry." Take a moment and imagine those sensations. Well, maybe not the painful aspects of them. Imagine that the words you read or the language you hear penetrating so deeply inside of you that you experience a physical side effect. Like when you listen to music and you get the chills, or when you read a book or watch a movie and you get so involved that you mourn the death of a favorite character, like they were your personal friend. It seems to me that that is what Emily Dickinson is talking about, being moved by something. And it's such a beautiful, visceral, and charged definition that rings with as much truth today in 2023 as when she said it in, I believe it was 1864. I'll have future me check the date. And she's not the only one describing poetry as having that kind of power. Walt Whitman claimed that good poetry sent a static charge through his beard. Dylan Thomas said that poetry is what makes me laugh, cry, prickle, be silent, makes your toenails twinkle, makes me want to do this or that, or nothing. Percy Shelley marked it as what is deeply felt and essentially unsayable. Carl Sandburg said, among many other things, that poetry is an echo asking a shadowed dancer to be a partner. For me, though, reading good poetry feels like the universe is expanding inside of my skull. My heart pounds, my breath catches, and my consciousness zooms to the far reaches of everything, where I have a moment, just one single moment of sheer euphoric weightlessness. And then zoom, I fall back into my body, a changed person. Now, that's a lot to go on, and it all sounds like Merriam-Webster's concentrated imaginative awareness, to be frank. But now that we have more to go off of concentrated imaginative awareness doesn't really seem to cut it. It's so deeply personal and different for us all. That's precisely why poetry is so hard to define. So let's dig a little bit deeper and maybe shy away from some of the more emotive definitions. In his masterclass, Billy Collins, the US Poet Laureate from 2001 to 2003, said that he finds the definition of a poem as being an arrangement of lines whose length is determined by some principle other than the width of the page, particularly useful. And it's true that a lot of poems, dare I say most, have some form or other where the lines don't span the width of the page and are even broken into sort of paragraphs called stanzas, which can be irregular as well. But there are poems that do span the width of the page, like prose poems. And there's also writing that doesn't span the width of the page and isn't poetry, like recipes, lists, or instructions. Then there is poetry which isn't even page-bound at all, like deaf poetry. To my mind, this definition doesn't really do poetry justice, but it does introduce the point of form, which is an important consideration in a poem. Now, Marianne Moore said that poetry is the art of creating imaginary gardens with real toads. And that's really a charming definition if you think about it. And it gets at the core, the spirit of poetry, if you will, of blending imagination and reality, but it's not quite technical enough for what we need, but we will keep it on the back burner. Wordsworth said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Whereas T.S. Eliot said that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Clearly, they don't agree. And to be fair, when asked what poetry is, most people do respond that it's emotion or writing down feelings. But if that was solely the case, music, narratives, and even some creative nonfiction could technically be included in the definition of poetry. And for that matter, traditional haiku and T.S. Eliot's work wouldn't. But considering emotional content for our definition is important because poetry can be emotive or have an emotional context that is vital to the work. Khalil Gibran, a Lebanese poet, said that poetry is a deal of joy and pain and wonder with a dash of the dictionary. I'm a bit partial to this definition because, as you'll come to find, the dictionary is actually one of the poet's most powerful tools. And finally, Mina Alexander, in her address to the Yale Political Union, stated that poetry's task is to reconcile us to the world, not to accept it at face value or to assent to things that are wrong, but to reconcile one in a larger sense, to return us to love, the province of imagination, to the scope of our mortal lives. That's pretty heady. So, as we can see, no poets truly agree on what poetry is, but there is a little bit of this back and forth tension of emotion versus thought and imagination versus reality. So I think those are important to keep in mind, but I think we need to gather a few more details. Now, for my experience, all of my professors have stressed that poetry is short, that it is compressed language where every word matters. And that can be true, but the same holds true for newspaper articles and ad copy, and those are some of the furthest things from poetry that I can think of. And while a lot of poetry is indeed brief, it isn't necessarily so. Consider Beowulf, for example. Now, there is the concept of the economy of words. That's the go-to phrase in the community. But it's more than just economy. I feel like James Baldwin said it best when he said, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter even but a millimeter of the way people look at reality, then you can change it." And that brings us back to that push and pull of reality versus imagination. And finally, in reading poetry and writing it myself, and also deep diving into the craft and taking classes and doing all things related to poetry, really, I found that poetry at its very essence, is playing with language. You adjust where lines end, what punctuation you use, if you use any, what capitalization you use, if you use any, what tense you use, and basically you take all these rules of language and you bend and you break and you shred and you rearrange them to evoke that concentrated imaginative awareness, which is really cool if you think about it. But an argument can be made that all writing is playing with language in one form or another. So where does that leave us? These ideas seem to hit on some very important points, but they don't really give us a true definition, the kind that we can make a flashcard from. What we've got so far is that poetry elicits this sort of reaction, where your body feels physical sensations when it's your mind, not your body, that gets stimulated, almost like a synesthesial response. And while the lines that make up poetry frequently don't go to the end of the page, they can, but poems do require attention to form. Poems are usually brief, compressed, and have a depth of some sort where it juxtaposes the sensorial, or the emotional, or the rational, or the imaginary against what is agreed upon as reality, and it plays with language. That's a lot. And it sort of echoes the Merriam-Webster definition that we started with. What we have is more inclusive, but it doesn't get to the heart, really, of what poetry is, which is the proverbial building imaginary gardens with real toads. What we've come up is all about what is used to make it or what we can expect from it. I think it's missing the mark because we are conflating two separate ideas. Let's turn to another expert to see what I mean. In his book, Why Poetry, Matthew Zapruder differentiates poems from poetry. A poem, he says, is a machine created by a poet for the reader, which produces a poetic state of mind. He describes that state of mind as something close to dreaming while awake, a higher, more aware, more open, more sensitive condition of consciousness. That sounds a lot like Merriam-Webster's concentrated imaginative awareness and Emily Dickinson's coldness and partial decapitation, which is why I think, though, there's that third definition for Merriam-Webster about poetry being associated with things outside of the poem. Good movies, good music, good performances, good art in general elicits this type of response, doesn't it? And that response, in effect, is poetry. Now, Zapruder stresses that poetry isn't just a collection of poems, but rather poetry is what happens in the mind of the reader or the consumer of whatever art, and a good poem can reproduce that poetic state of mind repeatedly, which is why he calls it a machine. Now, we know that a poem isn't a literal machine, and thinking about it that way does kind of miss some of the nuances, which I'll elaborate in our next video. But I do like how poetry becomes something less tangible through this definition while still maintaining the efficacy. It still encapsulates our experiences with poetry, as different as they are, but it's also a lot more precise than concentrated imaginative awareness. Something close to dreaming while awake, a higher, more aware, more open, more sensitive condition of consciousness. There's something really beautiful about that. And in defining poetry this way, it leaves room for poetry to exist separate from poems. After all, how can justice or dance or irony be poetic if poems and poetry are inseparable? How can Emily freeze her brain? How can Walt Whitman have a tingly beard? How can Dylan Thomas have twinkling toes? And how can I have an expanding head away from a poem. I do. They did. We all do. And those moments of, let's admit it, non-drug induced altered consciousness, where we feel open and receptive to the smallest and the largest in equal measure simultaneously, that is poetry. More often than not, a poem doesn't even trigger it. It just happens that a really good poem is really good at triggering it. That leaves us with the question of how, though. How are poems so good at evoking this poetic state of mind? What about form and language and all the other stuff that we were looking at for our definition? Well, that's what I and the channel are here for. These are the topics we are going to explore, but for the sake of time, I'll leave you with this teaser for my next video, part 2 of How to Poe the Beginning, where we're going to talk about what poems are. A poem lets you delve deeper into the mind of any writer than any other form of writing does. And what's said in a poem kind of doesn't matter. Does that sound cool? Okay, check it out. After we're finished here, of course. Now, we've defined poetry as it's been defined before, and we've also addressed why all of those ways of defining it were kind of lacking. We also discovered that there is a difference between poems and poetry, and that poetry is more than just a collection of poems. It's a different mindset from where we usually live, one that's more open, more curious, and almost dreaming. Now that we've gone through this rigmarole, what's next? Well, how about we enter that state of mind together with a poem? Love like salt. It lies in our hands in crystals too intricate to decipher. It goes into the skillet without being given a second thought. It spills on the floor so fine we step all over it. We carry a pinch behind each eyeball. It breaks out on our foreheads. We store it inside of our bodies, in secret wineskins. At supper, we pass it around the table, talking of holidays and the sea. Love Like Salt is by Lisel Mueller, and it originally appeared in Alive Together, New and Selected Poems published by LSU Press in 1996. Now, I hope that poem showed you a better idea of what love is than my poem at the beginning, and I hope it evoked a poetic state of mind for you. If it did, let me know what it was like for you in the comments down below. I'll do my best to read and reply because I'm really curious what it feels like to you to look at the world in new and different ways. Now, a special thanks to LSU Press for letting me read Lisel Mueller's poem, and a special shout out to my husband Jay. I miss you, Love Bucket. Don't forget to like and subscribe so I can bring you more poetry and all things about it. And if you want to support poetic content in a more direct way, hop on over to my Patreon where you can become an official friend face for just $1 a month, which goes to buying props like my beret and keeping the fairy lights on. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. Peace out, friend faces, and remember, be kind to one another. Love and Poe.